Welcome. Oh, what a good crowd today. Thank you so much for returning for another exciting lecture in the Food for Thought Fall Series at the Whaling Museum. If you haven't already, now is the time to please silence your cell phones as to not disrupt the presentation. Thank you so much for once again supporting this free community program. We are thrilled to welcome Edward Melillo, the NHA's 2013 E. Jeffrey and Elizabeth Thaner Verney Fellow. Ted, as he is known, is an assistant professor of history and environmental studies at Amherst College, where he teaches a course on global environmental history and also the history of the Pacific world. His first book, Strangers on Familiar Soil, Rediscovering the Chile-California Connection, will be published by Yale University Press next year. He is a native Cape Codder who grew up in Falmouth, Massachusetts. So please, without further ado, please help us welcome Ted Melillo.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can everybody hear me? Whoa, that's, wow. Powerful stuff. Echo. So I first want to just thank everybody at the NHA for hosting me here for now what has been 4 great weeks of research over the past 2 years. Betsy, Libby, who couldn't be here today, I don't think, Ralph, Sarah, everybody at the NHA. There's Ralph back there. Thank you so much for all the assistance you've given me, and it's been wonderful to stay in the Thomas Macy house at 99 Main, although there was no heat in there last night. So I actually slept pretty well, but when I woke up, I was like, wow, this is chilly. So anyway, I'm going to talk just a little bit about my opening slide here. I'm working on a second book project called Out of the Blue, Nantucket and the Pacific World. I'm calling my talk today Nantucket and the Pacific Ocean, not to confuse anybody. But I've got 2 Nantuckets up on the image here, the one with which you are all, I hope, familiar. We're sitting on this one right now. And then to its right, another Nantucket. This is New Nantucket, which is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Here's a second map of it. And that's its location right there. And Elisha Folger of the Nantucket whaling ship Equator discovered this Nantucket in 1818, named it New Nantucket in the 1830s. It was renamed Baker Island, and it was a guano island covered in bird excrement. And in the 19th century, this was a very powerful fertilizer. And discoveries of these bird excrement islands in the Pacific were so important to U.S. political strategy at the time that in 1856, President Buchanan signed the Guano Islands Act, by which anyone who found an island in the Pacific could plant the U.S. flag on it and claim it as their poop island for the United States. The other Nantucket was actually covered in bird poop and was pretty important strategically for a little while. So there are 2 Nantuckets. There's one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic. So my project as a whole, whoops, the background map is actually missing. So you're going to have to use your imagination here. I don't know what happened on my slide projector. What you're going to have to imagine is the world's 3rd largest ocean, the Pacific, in the center of this map. And then Nantucketers, don't let this go to your head, but the Nantucket image is a little out of scale here. This is going to be tricky. This really will require imagination. Pretend that we're on the west coast of South America here. My second book project will look at a whole bunch of places in the Pacific where Nantucketers could be found throughout the 19th century. And what I'm really puzzling through in this project is how did Nantucketers understand their own identities through these encounters with Pacific peoples and ecosystems in the 19th century. Nantucketers were everywhere. They were smuggling arms to Chilean and Peruvian revolutionaries. They were in Paita, imagine that's the coast of Peru. They were in San Francisco. At least 500 Nantucket families sent members to the gold rush. They sailed around Cape Horn in their whale ships. They were in the midst of the Pacific in Hawaii. They were in New South Wales, Australia. They were in the Bay of Islands of New Zealand, and they were also in Fiji. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So in this mapless world in which we're existing, just pretend you're in the middle of the Pacific with me in Fiji. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about 2 Nantucketers who ended up by kind of chaos and other causations in Fiji during the 19th century. On a fateful afternoon in 1826, 2 Nantucket mariners reunited along the shores of an island far from home. Their encounter was not a planned rendezvous of New England whaling vessels in the North Atlantic. Rather, it was an unexpected meeting of Fijian canoes in the South Pacific. And here's an image of one of the types of Fijian canoes that these two men may have been in at the time. This is a canoe with an outrigger and a sail known as a thamakau in Fijian. I saw a canoe coming from Ambao, or bow, in which was a white man. This is William Carey, one of the Nantucketers, talking. As they came alongside our canoe, the white man reached out his hand and addressed me by my name. I was dumb with astonishment. At last he said, "Don't you know David Whippy?" "Yes," I answered. "I formerly knew him. He was a townsman of mine and an old playmate." "Well," said he, "I am that David Whippy." Whippy and Carey were castaways in Fiji, brought together by catastrophe and coincidence. In 1824, Captain Peter Dillon and the crew of the brig Calder had left Whippy, a young man consumed by wanderlust, on a Fijian beach to collect a cargo of tortoise shells, mother of pearl, and sandalwood for sale at the bustling entrepôts of Canton and Manila. And I'll show you an image of Whippy. It's a strange image because it seems to be part profile, part head-on shot. So it's sort of haunting. But here he is. This is David Whippy, born on Nantucket in 1802. He died in Fiji in 1871. And today I'll tell you a little bit about his story. Dillon failed to return for more than a decade, leaving David Whippy to fend for himself on the Fijian archipelago. The year after Whippy's arrival, Carey's ship, and we unfortunately don't have an image of Carey to my knowledge, although if anyone runs across one in the archives, please tell Betsy to contact me. Carey's ship, the Oh No, aptly named as you will see, ran aground on the remote Fijian island of Vatoa. And this map sort of works. It's pretty distorted up on that screen, but that's the best we can do. Here's the Fijian archipelago, which I'll talk more a little bit about when I get further into the talk. Here's the island where the Oh No was wrecked. And here's Fiji relative to Australia, and then placed in its larger context of the Pacific world. A raiding party of Fijian warriors from nearby Onoilau Island killed all of the 21-member crew but Carey, who survived the massacre by hiding in a cave for 2 days. A Vatoan headman discovered the stranded sailor, took pity on him, and welcomed Carey to his village as an honored guest. By the time Carey and Whippy reunited in 1826, these two Nantucket-born refugees had ascended regional Fijian social hierarchies, making their way into the retinues of prominent chieftains for whom they served as translators, advisors, and mercenaries. Whippy had even managed to earn the title of Mata Kibao, or envoy to Bao, one of Fiji's most powerful tribes. Following the 1808 introduction of firearms to the Fijian archipelago by the aptly named castaway Charles Savage, and here he is, he's actually looking pretty anemic in this photo, but he's got his gun in front of him, European and North American mariners became associated with an unprecedented wave of violence in South Pacific history. Between 1828 and 1850, Fijian chiefs bought at least 5,000 muzzle-loading guns from white traders. Tribal leaders used these arsenals to devastating effect in battle, escalating the destruction of internecine warfare between rival factions. Transplanted mariners like Whippy and Carey served as soldiers of fortune in a 12-year contest for regional dominance that pitted the great sea power of Bao against the land-based kingdom of Rewa. First, I'll show you a picture of Fijian warriors prior to the arrival of the musket, armed only with war clubs, a much less devastating but no less fearsome weapon. This is an 1884 staged photo by the New Zealand photographer Alfred Burton. And then I want to get you located here. The Great Civil War of Fiji, which occurred during this period in the mid-1800s, was fought between two places located right next to each other. Bao, right here, is a small island, and Rewa is actually part of the mainland near where Suva, Fiji's contemporary capital, is located. And Fiji is made up of two very large islands and then a series of much smaller islands in the archipelago. One anthropologist has referred to this prolonged conflict as Polynesians' equivalent to the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta. White men with muskets, as Fijians called them, were pragmatists who staked their survival upon expedient political alliances and dubious commercial ventures, about which I'll talk a little later. At a time when Fiji was becoming increasingly connected to global networks of commerce and conquest, castaways often served as impromptu ambassadors in the cultural borderlands between Pacific Islanders and Euro-American visitors. In the process, they became agents of change in Fijian history, participated in environmental transformation of the South Pacific, and served as harbingers of more extensive cross-cultural encounters to come. Fiji, a cluster of 332 islands, approximately 1,100 nautical miles northeast of New Zealand, offered both perils and possibilities to 19th century mariners. The archipelago's labyrinthine chains of coral reefs and coastal mangrove swamps presented hazards for wayward ships, while its precarious tribal politics and opaque customs proved baffling and at times deadly for stranded sailors, as we saw with Carey's party. Despite these obstacles, however, Yankees were enthralled by the astronomical profits to be made from collecting and selling the dried bodies of an unusual ocean-dwelling animal that flourished in Fiji's coastal shoals. Abundant populations of genus Holothuria, or sea cucumbers, thrived in these maritime habitats. Like starfish and sea urchins, sea cucumbers are echinoderms. They have slippery, collagen-filled skin, feed omnivorously on microscopic aquatic creatures, seafloor particles, and algae, and can vary in size from under an inch to 6 feet in length. And I'll show you first a couple quick slides to pause here of Bao. This is photographed in the late 1800s. Rewa, this is from, I'll talk about the Charles Wilkes expedition, the XX, the exploring expedition to Fiji in a bit. But this is a drawing from the books that record that expedition. And then this is the Queen of Rewa. So these two kingdoms are fighting a civil war in the mid-1800s in which these Yankee muskets play a major role. But here's the creature about which I'm talking. Fairly repulsive at first sight. These things really can get up to 6 feet in length. And in this case, the creature has been gutted and dried in the air, and it's being held open by a piece of charcoal. Known as bêche de mer, or sea spade in French, it's known as haishen in Chinese, dri in Fijian, the sea cucumber is considered a culinary delicacy and a potent natural medicine in many cultures. Since at least the Ming Dynasty, which runs from 1368 to 1644 Common Era, Chinese doctors have prescribed sea cucumber broth for such varied ailments as kidney disorders, high blood pressure, constipation, and impotence. The Bensao Gamu, a late 16th century medical compendium written by Chinese scientist Li Shizhen, provided the first written testimonial of the animal's extraordinary healing properties. By the 19th century, North American merchants were well aware of the sea cucumber's therapeutic reputation. As Benjamin Morel, a U.S. sealing captain and explorer who traveled in the South Pacific during the 1820s and 1830s, declared, quote, "The Chinese consider bêche de mer a very great luxury, believing that it wonderfully strengthens and nourishes the systems and renews the exhausted vigor of the immoderate voluptuary." Very graphic terms. Bêche de mer is really quite something. I have eaten it on 2 occasions during 2 trips to China that I took with my dad, and I was not terribly impressed. But this is one of the preparations of the bêche de mer that's most famous. This is a dish that emerged in the 1600s in China during the Qing dynasty, and the Emperor Kangxi was very impressed with this dish. It's called Buddha Jumps Over the Wall, and it contains shark fin, sea cucumber, and abalone. So it's sort of this trifecta of protein. And that may be one of the reasons it was so well liked by the Chinese imperial leaders. Not the tastiest stuff, but the idea here was that Buddhist monks who were vegetarian at the time would be so captivated by the taste of this soup that they would jump over the walls of their monasteries and come running to it whenever it was being cooked. So that's the story of Buddha. Buddha jumps over the wall. And then I just had to include this because I came across this recently and I just think it's too good to miss. This may be the one piece of music that has been written historically about the sea cucumber. And it's the avant-garde French composer Eric Satie who put together a piece called Desiccated Embryos, and the title could be taken in many different ways, but it was Satie's tribute to the sea cucumber. Ignorant people call it the sea cucumber. The Holothurian ordinarily climbs on rocks or rocky areas. Like the cat, this marine animal purrs. I've never actually heard any testimony to that fact, but moreover, it spins a disgusting silk. Light seems to bother it. And this is all set to music by Satie. It's definitely worth hearing. There are multiple YouTube versions of Satie's Ode to the Sea Cucumber. Other Westerners were less than enthusiastic about the sea cucumber's culinary potential. During his explorations of Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace described smoked bêche de mer as, quote, looking like sausages which have been rolled in mud and then thrown up the chimney, end quote. One of Wallace's contemporaries, Victorian journalist Peter Lund Simmons, was similarly dismayed by the sea cucumber, referring to it as, quote, an unseemly-looking substance of a dirty light or dark brown color, hard, rigid, and repulsive with a strong fishy odor. So while the Chinese were enamored of the sea cucumber, their Victorian counterparts were less than enthusiastic. Regardless of their incompatibility with Occidental tastes, products such as bêche de mer offered heartening prospects for merchants in search of goods to supply to the vast untapped markets of the Middle Kingdom. And in my teaching, one of the things I focus quite a lot on is the way that at this time, from the 16th century onwards, China was really a vacuum for silver coming out of the Americas that crossed the Pacific on the fabled Manila galleons. And so in many ways, Yankees are searching for products to trade with China that they can then in return get silk, jade, porcelain, lacquered goods, and most importantly, tea. The tea from the Boston Tea Party, of course, is one of the Yankee imports of this era. Given the unbridled Euro-American demand for China's fine silks, tea, jade, porcelain, and lacquered goods, Yankee entrepreneurs stood to gain from the opening of new commercial frontiers in the Pacific. During the early 1800s, New England captains rushed to transform Fiji's natural wealth into commodities that they could sell at Chinese treaty ports. Prior to the emergence of the sea cucumber trade, sandalwood was among the most sought-after cargoes for these North American traders, and many of these were Salem-based traders. And literally, many of the Salem mansions, if you go to downtown Salem, were built on the backs of sandalwood and sea cucumbers. The Chinese used the fragrant heartwood of the sandalwood tree as ceremonial incense, construction material for luxury decorative items, and an ingredient in perfumes, cosmetics, and medical preparations. And I've shown you just a few images here of those types of items. U.S. merchants felled and sailed off with over 50 tons of Fijian sandalwood in 1804. By 1814, the deforestation of the archipelago's extensive sandalwood forests was so comprehensive that commercial logging became obsolete. The end of the rapacious sandalwood harvest coincided with the emergence of a flourishing market for Fijian sea cucumbers. From the late 1820s through the 1840s, dozens of New England merchants, many of whom were captains from Salem, Massachusetts, built their fortunes on these bottom dwellers. Once the bêche de mer trade was in full swing, Whippy and Carey, our two Nantucketers, served as interpreters and labor recruiters for the ships that called at Fiji's islands in search of the slimy creatures. Gathering, preparing, and packaging sea cucumbers involved elaborate processes. Charles Pickering, the naturalist with the United States Exploring Expedition to the Pacific, which went into the Pacific between 1838 and 1842 to map the Pacific, search for resources, wrote of the sea cucumber, quote, to look at the small size of the prepared animal, reflect on the immense amount of industry there expended in making up a cargo, the complicated process of its preparation, it is certainly one of the most remarkable branches of business in the annals of commerce. Upon the arrival of a trading ship at one of the archipelago's coves, Carey, Whippy, and other intermediaries would negotiate with Fijian chiefs to recruit a workforce of teenage boys and teenage girls who would dive for sea cucumbers at low tide in exchange for a few shillings and several sacks of yams, corn, and sweet potatoes. Local workers then gutted the bêche de mer, as I showed you in that image, pickled them in cauldrons, and actually many of these cauldrons were try-pots that you see here. And you can still find try-pots that were manufactured in Vermont for boiling maple syrup that were then used by Salem merchants on Fijian shores to prepare sea cucumbers and are still sitting around on the beaches of Fiji. And they look exactly like that. And spread out the bodies for one or more sessions of sun drying or smoking. In the 1840s, Mary Davis Wallace, wife of a Salem captain Benjamin Wallace, accompanied her husband on a voyage to the Pacific aboard the bark Zotov and wrote of the ship's stopover, quote, "At the Fiji Islands, to procure a cargo of," she called it, "bêche de mer, some of the natives preceded and others followed us to the building where the bêche de mer was drying. A deep trench is usually dug the whole length of one of the houses, which is filled with burning logs of wood. And we're very fortunate to have one of the Wilkes expedition's images of this. It's a little grainy up here, but this is a drawing from the Wilkes expedition, again, which went into the Pacific from 1838 to 1842. And the engraver is a remarkable engraver as well as the artist here. Agate did a whole bunch of pictures of what they saw in the Pacific. And this is the bêche de mer house, built upon logs, and then these are the drying racks, and as you can see, native workers are preparing logs beneath to light these massive fires. And often the bêche de mer houses themselves caught on fire, and it could be quite a sight that you could see miles out to sea as one of these things went alight. Like the sandalwood trade that preceded it, the relentless sea cucumber harvest wreaked havoc on Fiji's environment. Round-the-clock fires at the drying houses demanded a continuous fuel supply, resulting in further deforestation of the surrounding islands. Meanwhile, sea cucumber populations plummeted, and the sea cucumber is an essential organism at one of the bottom levels of the trophic pyramid, the food pyramid, in the oceanic ecosystems around Fiji's islands. So as its population plummeted, there were a bunch of downstream effects of this that were disastrous for those ecosystems. Sounding a prescient note, an article in the January 1878 issue of the U.S. magazine Frank Leslie's Popular Monthly commented, quote, "Like many other favorite delicacies, such as the oyster of Great Britain, the bêche de mer has been overfished, and unless the government," and they're unclear about which government here, "establishes a close time, the employment of gathering it must cease to exist." And I'm very fascinated by quotes like this because they give us a sense of a 19th century awareness of limits to growth and of population declines that resulted from these rapacious commodity harvests. And a number of scholars have suggested that really in the 19th century, folks aren't that aware of these ecological consequences of their actions, but enough evidence is emerging to kind of mount an opinion to the contrary. The sea cucumber trade was just one among a litany of entrepreneurial ventures that occupied Whippy's attention during his Fijian years. Robert Shershon Swanston, another U.S. expatriate who wandered the Pacific in search of economic opportunities, imported thousands of plants to Fiji's islands from elsewhere in the Pacific during the mid-1800s. Whippy received at least 3,500 of these botanical specimens in 1862 alone. So Whippy, to sort of coin a term here, was a biotic baron of these islands, bringing in plants from all over the Pacific and trying them out for their economic potential on Fiji's fertile soils. That year, 1862, as Swanson recounted, quote, "Mr. Whippy on Wakaya erected a cane mill and boiled about 2 tons of syrup, which he actually did in try-pots, the first attempt on a large scale to turn the sugar cane to account. Samples were sent to Sydney, but the sugar companies gave no encouragement to ship. So that was a flop, and Whippy then turned to cotton. Whippy also experimented with manufacturing coconut oil and growing cotton, and he also founded Whippy, Simpsons & Keswick, one of Fiji's first international businesses. The company built a 20 metric ton schooner designed for trading voyages to and from Australia. In 1840, when Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, and this is the Wilkes expedition again, arrived in Fiji, Whippy served as a guide and interpreter for his officers, a role that later earned him the title of Honorary U.S. Vice Consul in Fiji. So Whippy was also a diplomat at this time. During his early Fiji years, Whippy made his home at Levuka on the island of Ovalu, 7 miles from Viti Levu. I'll show you Levuka here. Yeah, the map looks kind of whitewashed, but this is again the main island, and Rewa and Bao are located right here, and this is the island on which Whippy took up residence. News of Whippy's dominant presence on Ovalu was widespread. An 1869 story in the New Bedford Whalemen's Shipping List and Merchants Transcript noted, quote, "There were about 30 sailors on the island who had mostly run away from ships or had somehow floated to these shores. The principal man among them, and the one that had the most influence with the chiefs, and in fact was a very respectable and steady man, was David Whippy, who 30 years before had left a Nantucket whaler," they're a little incorrect on this, "and making friends with the chief of Lebuka, had settled there. He had a number of wives, which I'll talk about in a second, as a matter of course, and had a considerable progeny." I've looked at baptism records from the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Fiji, and I figured out that Whippy fathered at least 11 children, and the estimate, I think, goes as high as about 16. Adituli of Namara gave birth to Whippy's first son, David. Eunice of Koro became the mother of 2 other sons, Thomas and Daniel. Later, Whippy married Takosa, also known as Dorcas, the daughter of a village chief, and they had several sons as well, and the many generations of Whippys that followed have become one of Fiji's largest ancestral groups that are called in Fijian Kailoma, which means mixed-race Fijians. Whippy remained in Fiji and spent his later years on Wakaya Island until his death in 1871. His descendants inherited a 12,000-acre property known as Yadali in the district of Wainunu, which Whippy had originally purchased, and get this, for 6 kegs, 40 canisters of gunpowder, 5 muskets, 3.5 pigs of lead, 3 dozen axes, 34 knives, 500 musket balls, 10,200 yards of cotton cloth, 10 iron pots, valued at a total of $398. So he bought his 12,000 acres for merchandise valued at $398. Unlike Whippy, Carey returned to Nantucket in the 1830s, and this is how many Nantucketers came to know of this story. After nearly a decade in Fiji, Carey shipped out from Massachusetts as a common sailor aboard the Salem schooner Tybee. In 1928, the Nantucket Enquirer and Mirror published Carey's reminiscences of his time in the South Pacific under the provocative title, Wrecked in the Fijis, and I haven't given you the subtitle here, but Experience of a Nantucket Man a Century Ago who was the sole survivor of the whale ship Oh No and lived for 9 years among the cannibals of the South Sea Islands. What I've put up here for you is an image on the left of the Nantucket Enquirer's original publication of a letter from Carey 2 years after the massacre in 1828. The letter took up 2 columns of the second page of the Enquirer and actually listed all of the crew members who'd been massacred. Then the full account is not published until 100 years later in 1928. And I've been looking through the pamphlets at the NHA Research Library, and they've got about 5 iterations following on from the 1928 one that were subsequently printed, and several presses have reprinted this. Long after Whippy's death and Carey's departure, Fiji's environment has struggled to recover from successive phases of export-oriented commodity booms. Following the devastating decline of the 19th century, Fiji's sea cucumber population has experienced a modest revival, in part because of efforts to develop sustainable aquaculture programs. As of 2013, Fiji's bêche de mer export trade is worth an annual US $3 million a year, but profits from this lucrative enterprise rarely trickle down to villagers who sell their harvest to middlemen at a small fraction of the prices that the product attains on the international market. Meanwhile, Fiji's tropical forests remain critically endangered as a result of widespread timber extraction and the extensive conversion of woodlands to plantation agriculture. And here's a shot of Fijian deforestation. Between 1993 and 2008, Fiji lost 173,000 acres of forest. This is on a tiny island archipelago. In addition, neither Whippy nor Carey could have envisioned that rising sea levels due to climate change would pose another pressing ecological threat shared by the coastal zones of Fiji and Nantucket. Here are trends. This is inches on the y-axis of global average absolute sea level over time. And then here are a few images with which many of you will be intimately familiar of rising rates of erosion in Nantucket due to sea level rise. And in fact, this is a pervasive issue in both Fiji and here in Nantucket that we're all going to be dealing with over time. More hopeful international connections have reinvigorated the long-distance relationships between these two island communities. In 1964, Nantucket summer resident Charles J. Carpenter Jr., I don't know, is he here perhaps? Is Charles Carpenter here? No. Okay. I wanted to point him out if he was actually sitting in the audience. Traveled to Fiji and met many of David Whippy's descendants. 6 years later, Carpenter hosted Whippy's great-grandson, Stanley Whippy, during his visit to Nantucket. And these Whippy visits go on and on and on. Here's another one from 1978. The research library has hosted multiple visits of Whippy descendants. And in fact, you all emailed me a few weeks before I got here saying, there's a Whippy here and she's really sad she's going to be missing your leg. How many weeks ago was that, Betsy? In August, yeah. And so the Whippys continue to come to Nantucket, and I know that many Nantucketers have continued to go to Fiji in search of their ancestral lines as well. As Charles Carpenter, Stanley Whippy, and others discovered, the Whippys of Fiji and the Whippys of Nantucket trace their roots to the same seafaring family, with or without the E. It's sometimes spelled W-H-I-P-P-E-Y, and sometimes the E before the Y is eliminated. But you'll find Whippys all over the island, hidden in various parts of Nantucket's history. Nearly 2 centuries on from the fortuitous rendezvous of Nantucket castaways along Fiji's shores, the South Pacific and the North Atlantic appear to be closer than ever. So I'll end there and take questions from the audience. Shall I moderate?
Anybody have a question that they'd like to ask Ted? Nothing?
And if not, I have a few more slides that I'd be happy to chat about. But
what's the market for the bêche de mer? Who's buying them? Where do they eat them? Still in China?
So the bêche de mer market is largely dominated by China and Japan. In Japan, it's called namako, and you can actually get it at sushi restaurants in California. I haven't seen it at sushi places on the East Coast, but China and Japan dominate, but the United States has become a big market for bêche de mer as well. And the total bêche de mer market now exceeds $10 million a year from Pacific Islands to China, Japan, and to the United States. So it's a pretty big market. But again, there really is the question of who is accruing the profits. Often local villagers do the harvesting, but then there's so many steps in the commodity chain that various middlemen are making the real markups on the bêche de mer. And there are multiple species in genus Holothuria that range from quite small bêche de mer to these 6-foot-long ones. And the quality of the taste of the different species apparently is really important. The white bêche de mer, the white sea cucumbers, are considered to be the finest. The stuff I ate in China didn't really appeal to my stomach, but it may be just simply an acquired taste, or I may have been eating the wrong species of bêche de mer, I don't know. But they're now often aquacultured in big pools off the coast. So.
You mentioned cannibalism. A few years ago, a gentleman was lecturing here, and he did extensive research among these South Pacific tribes and cannibalism, and he said he had never found any positive proof that there was cannibalism among these tribes. What do you think of that?
I think it's a scholarly quagmire, and I'm wary to wade into it because there's a huge scholarly debate about cannibalism. One of the great scholars of Pacific anthropology, Marshall Solins, who actually wrote the book I was referencing when I was talking about how he called the Polynesian Wars the Peloponnesian Wars, says absolutely there was cannibalism everywhere, and the evidence, the archives are replete with evidence, and to kind of say that there wasn't almost belittles the cosmology of Pacific peoples who consider this a quite normal practice culturally and as part of the art of war. I'll go out on a limb here, though. I was debating whether to say this. I think both Carrie and Whippy certainly were part of cannibalistic ceremonies. There's enough in Carrie's accounts that makes it quite clear that he was perfectly happy and Carrie did and Whippy did participate in several massacres, and there is a much darker side to this story. At one point, Whippy dressed up as a Fijian chieftain and shot the rival chief through the head with a musket, which was violating many codes and sort of laws of Fijian warfare. And then they go and they burn a village that has 400 people in it. And they're pretty celebratory about this. They actually revel in this afterwards. And it's all this you can read. It's in Wrecked in the Fijis. It's in Carey's published account. And so they were certainly participants in whatever rituals were going on at the time. But then again, it's so controversial, and it's not a controversy that I feel I have a lot to contribute to, so I'm going to have to figure out how to deal with this in the book. But I think there are definitely two sides to this story. But I don't think it actually helps Pacific cultures a whole lot to deny that this happened. It's a different cosmology. It's a different way of understanding life in the universe. And as Solons points out, it's about time to just recognize that this is a different mode of thinking than the European imperialist mode of thinking that's been imposed upon that post facto. So that may be both elusive and gruesome in its details, but that's the way I would dance around the topic.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes, what happened to Carey when he came back to the Massachusetts area?
Carey lived out a pretty peaceful life as far as I can tell. He was a merchant for a little while. He dabbled in sheep, and then I think died a quite peaceful death back in Nantucket. Both of them had sort of easy ends to their lives. Whippy really retired to his estate, and Carey, as far as I know. I haven't followed Carey's story post-return to Nantucket, and I'd like to do that. That's a subject for further research. But he's a little hard to track down, actually. And I really would love it if you all ever come across a picture of Carey. It may just not exist, but that would be fantastic to have. But yeah, they both died fairly peaceful lives on their adopted and home islands, as far as I can tell.
Did any of the local Whippies here go visit their relative in Fiji?
A bunch of them have, actually, and I know of 5 visits at least.
In his lifetime?
Oh, not in his lifetime, no. But Whippy descendants from Nantucket have gone back multiple times to pay visits to. And there's been a real controversy over the Whippy legacy because, of course, there's this 12,000-acre parcel of land. And the will was very unclear about the inheritance of that land. And so this is a big deal among the Kailoma, is to figure out who really was mentioned. And there's a whole document trail that you can follow about how the land was divided up. It was divided up in a very bizarre way. And so there's lots of controversy, and there are many Whippy genealogical sites online where the Whippies are debating their legacies and how they came to be part of the Whippy clan, and therefore how they maintain title to that land. And so making sure that you're part of the Whippy clan is a big deal in terms of property inheritance. And there have been Whippy reunions with several thousand people in attendance. I've read the programs from 2 Whippy reunions, and these are big, big deals. Anyone else? Yeah.
One of the pastors of First Baptist Church, Summer Street Church, is Whippy.
Oh, really?
With an E. And
With an E.
he also has a stained glass window in our church with his name on it.
Oh, I should get an image of that. I should take a photograph
Yes.
of that. Yeah, absolutely. And there was another Whippy, William Whippy, who's also kind of a topic of interest for me because William Whippy, and Fran Kartinen, who's over there, who has written this marvelous book, Other Islanders, illuminated this point for me. William Whippy ran a Kanaka boarding house, which was the term used generically for Hawaiians on island. And I'm interested in this project, not only looking at Nantucketers in the Pacific, but also Pacific peoples who came to Nantucket. And so we don't know a whole lot about William Whippy's boarding house, but Whippy was a New Zealander. He had a Maori mother, and he came to the island and married Maria Ross, the African-American daughter of a major abolitionist. So that story in and of itself is a whole side trajectory that will probably get folded into this. But Fran really has done the early research on that, and then the NHA has the sign from Whippy's Kanaka boarding house. That's Whippy with an E, but they are clearly related. I haven't parsed that out quite yet because I have Whippy's family tree. It starts to get very complicated, but I hope to do that as this research proceeds.
What are some of the other areas that you'd like to continue exploring in this field?
Well, there are a number of things that I'd like to continue exploring, but one is whale's teeth, and there's a great collection here of scrimshaw, but these were extremely valuable objects for Fijians in the mid-19th century and earlier. They were called tabua, and I don't know, I had meant to ask you this.
No, we don't have any.
You don't have any tabua.
Is it tabua or tabua? What's the spelling?
I think the accent is on the second.
Because many also use tambua.
Yeah.
I heard it tambua. We definitely don't have any tabuas.
I was at a conference on the American West and the Pacific world, and there was a big Fijian contingent at this. It was actually in Utah, and one of the things they were interested in is Mormonism in the Pacific, and they pronounced it tabua, and with the emphasis on the second syllable. And these are items where there's sperm whale teeth, of course, and so, right over here you can see where these come from. And what happens is over time, as they're passed among clansmen, they take on a darker and darker hue as your oils from your palm end up permeating the outer layers of the whale's tooth. And the darker the tabua, the more respected and honored it is as a sacred object, because it shows that it possesses this history of interactions among prominent individuals. But going beyond Fiji, I'm looking at all these other sites that I had to show you on that invisible map of the Pacific. And so I've done a lot of the research on California at the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley. And there are really fascinating stories about Nantucketers who ended up going to the gold rush in California. They were so used to sailing around Cape Horn in their whale ships that many of them just went out for another voyage rounding Cape Horn for the 13th, 14th time, sailing up the west coast of South America and ending up in California. And I've taken photographs of at least 20 Nantucketers whose gravestones still exist in California cemeteries. And I'm tracking down those stories. Even before the gold rush, though, Henry Delano Fitch and a number of other Californians were of Nantucket ancestry. And there's a real Nantucket, California link that I'll explore in one of the chapters. So those are some of the other areas. I think that was the last slide I had that I'm interested in exploring. Also, I was in New Zealand in February and started to look into the Nantucket presence in the Bay of Islands on the North Island of New Zealand. And Bill Trampush has written a little bit about this and lived in New Zealand for something like 12 years, but I'm hoping to pursue that as one of the chapters in this as well. And there were lots of connections between one of the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, the Maori, or the Maori, as it's sometimes pronounced, and Nantucket, to the point where Ralph and I yesterday found a photograph of a Nantucket whaler who married a Maori woman and then ended up on the Chatham Islands with her. And there's a quite good photograph in the Nantucket Historical Association's archives of him in his whaling gear with his Maori wife on the Chatham Islands in the Pacific. So those will be some of the other areas I'm going to be looking into with the project. But I'm also really interested in this environmental angle. Many whalers were kind of early oceanographers, and they give us some of our first data on charts about underwater topography, about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, about migratory patterns of creatures far beyond just the whales they're pursuing. And there were several women who were the keepers of that scientific knowledge on board ships as whalers' wives who were keeping the latitude, the longitude, the scientific data. And I'm very interested in the way those women were the keepers of early U.S. oceanography. And then people like Matthew Mowry, the naval lieutenant who does the oceanographic charts for rounding Cape Horn, build upon this whale ship data, as did Benjamin Franklin in the Pacific, for actually charting sea currents. So that sort of environmental angle to this project is also a big dimension of it. And we'll see how this evolves over the next few years as I'm writing this book. So any other questions? We're good on time, actually. We still have about 10 minutes, if anyone. Yeah, in the back.
State of the environment in
It's a really mixed bag. As I showed you, there's been massive deforestation, and some of these commodity booms have put a lot of pressure on Fiji's fisheries. And Fiji has lived under various forms of colonialism. 1874, they became a British territory. Australia has always played a very strong role in Fiji's governance. Fiji's had several coups. And so that all has environmental effects in terms of the governance of fairly fragile ecosystems over time. But I think the big issue for most island nations, most small island nations right now, is simply sea level rise due to climate change. They're just losing so much coast that the people on Kiribati are being relocated to Fiji because their islands are almost completely underwater. The Marshall Islands now, they're building concrete causeways just to keep some of their land above water. And you know, for Nantucket, this is already a big issue, and it's just going to become bigger. Because if you look at, I haven't put them up here, and I'm not a geologist, but if you look at erosion rates on Nantucket's coastline, it's an exponential curve, and it's due to climate change. There's always been erosion, and there's always been coastal change, but the rates of that change and the scope and intensity of that change, I think, is ratcheted up remarkably high as a result of climate change. So, you know, that I think for Fiji is the big environmental issue.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. If you have any further questions for Ted, feel free to see him after the presentation, but let's all give a round of applause for Ted Melillo.
Thank you.